The Harris family homesteaded on the slopes of Wheeler Mountain from 1912 to 1926. What follows is the text from an interview with Alex Harris in about 1980. To begin with, Dad and I made a shelter with a couple of logs, and we covered that with brush. I was only a kid at the time, but I got on one end of the crosscut saw enough to steady it so Dad could cut the logs for our house. When we had the logs up, a roof on, and a floor in, my mother and sisters moved up from Kamloops. We all slept in one big room until Dad built partitions and made 2 bedrooms and a sitting room. It was pretty hard going, but after a while we got a cow and a little milk, a few chickens and eggs. By then we figured we were in clover. Before long we had a vegetable garden, and by fall we were storing meat and produce in a root cellar that we built in the gully just behind the house. We kept everything cold in warmer weather with ice from Wheeler Lake that we preserved with sawdust from an old mill site down near Massey's Homestead. We were luckier than most because there was a spring on our place and we had water flowing from a 2-inch pipe into a watering trough for the cattle and horses. We irrigated our garden by making ditches and running water between the rows. We had about 3 or 4 acres of potatoes. And then one year there was so many on the market we had to throw most of ours away. My dad said that was it. He was not going to plant another potato. But I said all the other fellows would be quitting the next year and there'd surely be a shortage. Sure enough, it turned out that way, and my hands were skinned and blistered from picking those potatoes. Dad plowed the field when the frost came, and we gathered those potatoes and put them in the root cellar. There was so many we had to store some at Pruden's place down the way and sold them through the winter to the Hudson's Bay for $100 a ton. That made my dad. We grow our own vegetables and hay, but first the fields had to be cleared of rocks. We used a stone boat, horse, and plow, and my sisters and I moved enough rocks to build 5 houses. We grew mostly wheat and oat hay. Dad harvested it with a mower and a rake, and we cocked it, hauled it, and stacked it. Some was left to ripen for seed, and the rest was barely enough to bring our animals through the winter. We had pigs, horses, chickens, ducks, a few beef, and some milk cows. My mother milked the cows and could slope haystacks so that they came up to an absolute peak. She used to can and make jam from the Saskatoons and all the wild berries. And when women in the area were having their babies, she was the midwife. I cannot remember how many Nelsons she delivered. In those days, you worked hard and ate well. We hunted ducks, geese, rabbits, willow and blue grouse. We used to fish down in Tronquil Creek and could catch about 100 to 150 little ones, and boy, were they good fried in butter. We had rattlesnake serum, but never used it as no one got bitten. There was lots of rattlers around, and I killed quite a few, but now I do not think a rattlesnake is dangerous. We lost a few chickens to hawks, but never lost one to a rattlesnake. Once in a while there were a few cougars around and always lots of coyotes, but they did not come close to the house. There was a $5 bounty on coyotes at that time, and some of the fellows hunted them unmercifully with hounds. Mother sold eggs and butter, but cordwood was our biggest item. We logged during the winter, and it was heavy work. Sometimes the horses would drop through a snowdrift right down to their neck yoke, and Dad would have to shovel them out. We got a lot of snow up there, and roads were often blocked. But we had no trouble keeping warm in the house as there was lots of pitch in the pine wood, and you could get the old stove just a-dancing. Sometimes the stovepipes got red hot, and Mother would be scared to death. Dad and I worked through the flu epidemic that hit Kamloops in the fall of 1918. I remember hauling cordwood to the old Patricia Hotel in Chinatown and down to the hospital. It was a big hospital, and you could see the patients through the window. A fellow would come up to us and say, "Hey, we've got people dying for your wood. Bring it over to the sick people, and we will pay you for it." So we dumped it at the hospital. We were lucky, and none of the people from Wheeler Flats were sick during that epidemic. Most of the homesteaders worked in town whenever they could. After Dad got the crop in, he would try to get on a summer crew digging post holes for the BC Telephone Company. He was usually sent somewhere out by Shuswap Lake, and we did not see him until he came back with a little money in the fall. You could not count on much in those days, but it all helped. That was how we bought a few clothes, and one year we bought a gramophone. I used to earn a little money in the spring and summer killing a couple of calves for veal every week for a neighbor, Joe Bowman. When the war started, quite a few of the homesteaders enlisted. Dad tried, but he could not pass the medical. Right after the war, the drought came and we ran out of water. Just all of a sudden, the spring dried up and some years we had no crops. Those were terrible dry years in the 20s. We dug the well 40 to 50 feet deep, but could not reach water. So Dad pulled out. That was 1925 or 1926, and we had been in there for nearly 15 years. He sold his quarter section to Joe Bowman for $450 and took the animals and farm equipment down to an auction sale at Halston Station. There was nothing else he could do. But I often remember the good times we had, like swimming and picnicking at McQueen Lake, visiting the people around Lac du Bois, or skating on Massey's Pond. We always had community parties and dances in the schoolhouse, and there was a fellow up there who could really play the violin. He was a professional violinist who apparently came from Oslo University in Norway, and every time Scathrude played, I would just sit there and listen. I wanted to grow up and play that thing in the worst way. So I picked apples at Tronquil for 10 cents a box until I could send for a $10 violin and bow from Eaton's catalog. I rode 10 miles into town to take lessons for 50 cents an hour. And later, I ended up playing first violin in the 25-piece symphony orchestra in Kamloops. It was a tough life on Wheeler Mountain, and you had to use your head to survive. But it was one of the best educations you could have, and you could never buy that.